December 27, 1941. The North Sea off Norway's coast. Temperature 3 degrees. Lieutenant Colonel John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill, 35 years old, British No. 3 Commando, standing at the front of a landing craft heading toward German-occupied Vågsøy Island. In his hands, Scottish bagpipes. On his hip, a basket-hilted claymore sword forged in 1740. Across his back, a longbow and 24 barbed arrows. 0 modern automatic weapons. The German garrison ahead had 150 soldiers, machine gun nests, and artillery positions. Churchill's commanding officers had called his weapons a circus act. The War Office wanted him court-martialed for refusing to carry a Thompson submachine gun. Fellow commandos wagered he wouldn't survive the first 5 minutes of combat. What happened in the next 6 hours would make Jack Churchill a legend and prove that the oldest weapons in human history could devastate the most modern army on Earth. If you want to discover how medieval weapons performed against Nazi Germany's military machine, smash that like button right now. It helps us share these forgotten stories. And subscribe if you haven't already, because you won't believe what happens next. At 0645 hours on December 27th, Churchill's landing craft hit the beach at Vågsøy, Norway. Before the ramp dropped, he was playing March of the Cameron Men on his bagpipes at full volume. The sound carried across the frozen beach. German soldiers 200 yards inland stopped moving. They had never heard bagpipes in combat. The confusion lasted 17 seconds. That was all Churchill needed. He jumped from the landing craft while still playing, bagpipes screaming into the dawn. Then he dropped the pipes, pulled a grenade from his belt, and threw it 40 yards into the German position. The explosion killed 3 soldiers. Churchill unsheathed his claymore and charged directly into the smoke, screaming, "Commando!" at the top of his lungs. His men followed. The Germans were still trying to understand what they were seeing when Churchill reached their position. A British officer with a sword. In 1941, running at them like it was 1314 at Bannockburn. The first German soldier raised his rifle. Churchill swung the claymore in a horizontal arc. The blade caught the German across the chest. The soldier dropped. The second German turned to run. Churchill chased him down and drove the sword through his back. Medieval brutality in a modern war. The remaining Germans in that position surrendered immediately. Not because they were outgunned, because they were terrified. This was not the war they had trained for. But Churchill's real weapon wasn't the sword. It was what he did next that changed British commando tactics forever. At 0721 hours, Churchill spotted a German patrol moving along a ridge 400 yards inland. 8 soldiers, moving in tactical formation, standard Wehrmacht procedure. They hadn't seen the British landing yet. Churchill grabbed his longbow. His fellow commandos thought he was insane. Longbows had been obsolete for 400 years. The maximum effective range against armored targets was 200 yards. These Germans weren't armored, but they were moving, and the wind was gusting at 15 knots from the northwest. Churchill nocked an arrow, drew the bowstring back to his ear. 40-pound draw weight, nothing like the 100-pound warbows of the medieval period, but enough. He led the target, compensated for wind, and released. The arrow flew in a flat trajectory. 2 seconds of flight time. 30 yards from the target, the German sergeant at the front of the patrol took the arrow through the center of his chest. He fell without making a sound. His men never heard the shot. No muzzle flash, no rifle crack, nothing. They dropped to the ground, scanning for the shooter, seeing nothing. Churchill had just recorded the last confirmed longbow kill by a British soldier in the history of warfare. But he wasn't finished. He nocked another arrow and fired at the prone Germans. This arrow struck a soldier in the shoulder. The man screamed. Now the patrol knew the direction. They returned fire with Mauser rifles. Bullets kicked up dirt 20 yards from Churchill's position. But Churchill had already relocated. He moved 30 yards west and nocked another arrow. The Germans were firing at where he had been, not where he was. Churchill shot again. Third arrow, third hit.
This one struck a German in the leg. The patrol broke. They abandoned their position and ran inland, leaving 2 dead and 1 wounded behind.
The raid on Vågsøy continued for 6 hours. Churchill moved through the island like a ghost from another century. Sword in hand, longbow across his back, bagpipes strapped to his side. He had become a psychological weapon. German soldiers who saw him spread word through their units. The British have sent a madman. He fights with a sword. Morale collapsed in sections where Churchill operated. Soldiers who would hold positions against machine gun fire abandoned posts when they heard he was approaching. At 11:34 hours, Churchill reached a German command bunker on the north side of the island. Intelligence said 12 soldiers were inside, including an officer. Standard assault procedure required grenades and automatic fire. High casualties expected. Churchill had a different approach. He walked to the bunker entrance and kicked the door open. Inside, 12 Germans with rifles. Churchill standing in the doorway with a claymore. 1 man with a medieval sword against 12 with modern firearms. The Germans should have opened fire immediately. They didn't. They froze. Churchill screamed in German, "Raus! Alle raus! Schnell!" Out, everyone out, quickly. Then he added something that revealed his understanding of the German military mind. "Ich bin Oberst, das ist ein Befehl." I am a colonel, this is an order. The psychology was brilliant. German military culture emphasized rank and obedience. Churchill was betting that even in combat, that conditioning would override survival instinct. He was right. The first German soldier stood up, laid down his rifle, and walked toward Churchill with his hands raised. Then the second, then the third. Within 90 seconds, all 12 Germans had surrendered to a man with a sword. 0 shots fired. Churchill marched them back to British lines and handed them to the provost marshal. The provost asked how Churchill had captured 12 armed men. Churchill explained he had ordered them to surrender. The provost asked what weapons Churchill had used. Churchill held up his claymore. The provost thought he was joking. But the most remarkable action was still ahead. At 15:47 hours, Churchill and Corporal Ruffel moved toward a German artillery position on a hill overlooking the harbor. The position had an 81mm mortar and 30 soldiers. This was a hardened defensive position. Attacking it with 2 men was suicide. Churchill had no intention of attacking. He was going to capture it. They approached from the east using the terrain for cover. At 50 yards from the position, Churchill studied the layout through binoculars. The Germans had set up the mortar in a natural depression. Good cover from naval gunfire, but it created a blind spot on the eastern approach. Churchill and Ruffel moved into that blind spot and crawled to within 15 yards of the position. The Germans never saw them. Churchill counted 32 soldiers total. Some were manning the mortar, others were resting. One officer was studying a map. Churchill stood up, sword in hand, and walked into the position as if he owned it. The first German to see him was a private who had been eating bread. The private stared. Churchill pointed the claymore at him and said in German, "Du bleibst ruhig," you stay quiet. The private stayed quiet. Churchill walked past him toward the officer. Other Germans were starting to notice. A British officer was in their position, with a sword, walking calmly toward their commanding officer like he was on parade. The German officer looked up from his map and saw Churchill standing 3 feet away. Churchill said, "Ihre Position ist umsingelt. Sie haben eine Minute, sich zu ergeben, oder Sie sterben alle." Your position is surrounded. You have 1 minute to surrender or you all die. The officer looked past Churchill. He saw Ruffel standing at the edge of the position with his rifle. The Germans assumed there were more British soldiers in the surrounding terrain. There weren't, just Churchill and Ruffel. But the bluff worked. The German officer ordered his men to lay down their weapons. All 32 soldiers complied.
Churchill had just captured an artillery position and 32 armed enemy soldiers using a sword and a lie. He marched the prisoners back to British lines. This time when he handed them over, his fellow commandos stopped laughing about the sword.
The Vågsøy raid ended at 14:45 hours. British forces withdrew to their ships. The operation was a tactical success. German positions destroyed, enemy casualties significant, British casualties minimal. But the real story was Jack Churchill. He had killed at least 4 Germans in close combat with medieval weapons, captured 44 prisoners, including an entire artillery position, and psychologically devastated German defenders in his sector. The War Office could no longer call his methods theatrical nonsense. They produced results. But Churchill's war was far from over. In 1943, he was deployed to Italy for the Allied landings at Salerno. The beachhead was chaos. German artillery hammered the landing zones. American and British units were pinned down. Churchill's commando unit was tasked with clearing German positions inland from the beach. Standard infantry work, except Churchill refused to do anything in a standard way. On September 14, 1943, Churchill led his unit toward a German strongpoint on a hill near the village of Pigoletti. The position had machine guns and mortars. Attacking uphill into that firepower was guaranteed to produce casualties. Churchill decided to bypass the fighting entirely. At 22:30 hours, he and Corporal Ruffle moved around the German position under cover of darkness. They approached from behind, where the Germans weren't expecting an attack. Churchill found the German command post. 6 officers inside, planning defensive operations. Churchill walked through the door with his claymore drawn. The Germans looked up from their maps. Churchill said in German, "Gentlemen, you are now prisoners of the British Army. You will order your men to surrender or I will kill you all right now." The senior German officer was a major. He looked at Churchill's sword, then at Churchill's face, then back at the sword. The major asked how many British soldiers were outside. Churchill said 200. There were 2. The major believed him and ordered his soldiers to surrender. The entire German position, 42 men, laid down their weapons. Churchill marched them back to Allied lines. For this action, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Order. But medals meant nothing to Churchill compared to the psychological impact he was having on German forces. Word was spreading through Wehrmacht units. Watch for the British officer with the sword. If you see him, surrender or run. Do not fight him. In 1944, Churchill was sent to Yugoslavia to assist Tito's partisan forces. His mission was to conduct raids against German positions in the Adriatic Islands. On the night of May 14, 1944, Churchill led an assault on a German-held tower on the island of Brach. The tower was defended by 50 German soldiers with machine guns. Churchill's force had 40 commandos. He decided to lead the attack personally. At 0300 hours, Churchill moved to the front of his unit and started playing his bagpipes. The sound echoed across the island. The Germans opened fire immediately. Bullets snapped past Churchill's head. He kept playing. His men charged behind him. The attack was pure insanity and pure Churchill. The Germans were so focused on the bagpipe player that they failed to notice the commandos flanking their position. Churchill reached the base of the tower and threw a grenade through a window. The explosion killed 3 Germans inside. Churchill climbed through the window with his sword and engaged the survivors in close combat. Medieval weapons in a stone tower. It was 1344 all over again, except with grenades and machine guns outside. Churchill killed 2 more Germans with his claymore before a German stick grenade exploded 6 feet from his position. The blast threw Churchill against a wall. Shrapnel tore through his shoulder and leg. He blacked out. When he woke up, he was surrounded by German soldiers. His bagpipes were destroyed. His sword was gone. But he was alive. The Germans had orders to execute commandos on sight. They didn't execute Churchill.
Later, German reports stated they believed he was insane and therefore not responsible for his actions under the Geneva Convention. Others said the Germans simply respected his bravery too much to kill him. Churchill was transferred to Sachsenhausen concentration camp near Berlin. The Germans thought the war was over for Mad Jack. They were wrong.
Sachsenhausen concentration camp, September 1944. Churchill was classified as a high-value prisoner and placed in a special section reserved for important captives. The Germans wanted to interrogate him about British commando operations. Churchill refused to cooperate. Instead, he spent his time planning an escape. Sachsenhausen was one of the most secure camps in the Reich. Electrified fences, guard towers, patrol dogs, searchlights. Escaping was considered impossible. On the night of September 14, 1944, Churchill and Royal Air Force officer Bertram James executed an escape plan that involved crawling under an electrified fence during a lightning storm. The rain masked the sound. The lightning disrupted the searchlights. They crawled through mud for 200 yards and reached the outer fence. Churchill used a piece of wood to lift the wire enough to squeeze under without touching it. James followed. They were outside the camp, free. But they were in the middle of Nazi Germany, 50 miles from the nearest neutral territory. They had no papers, no food, no weapons. Churchill had a plan: walk to the Baltic Sea and steal a boat. The distance was 125 miles. They moved at night, slept in forests during the day, and survived on raw vegetables stolen from farms. For 11 days, they evaded German patrols and police checkpoints. On September 25th, they were 5 miles from the Baltic coast when a German patrol spotted them near a farm outside Rostock. The patrol opened fire. James was hit in the leg. Churchill tried to carry him, but more Germans arrived. They were recaptured. The Gestapo interrogated them for 3 days. They wanted to know who had helped them escape. Churchill said no one. The Gestapo didn't believe him and beat him. Churchill maintained his story. Eventually, the Gestapo gave up and transferred him to a different camp in Austria. The new camp was in Tyrol, high in the Alps. Security was tighter. Churchill was placed in solitary confinement. The Germans were taking no chances. But Churchill had no intention of staying imprisoned. On May 4, 1945, he noticed something unusual. The guards were nervous. They kept looking toward the west. Churchill realized the Allies were close. Germany was collapsing. The guards knew it. That night, the camp lost electrical power. An Allied air raid had destroyed a power station 20 miles away. The lights went out. The electrified fences went dead. Churchill kicked open the door to his cell and walked out. No guards tried to stop him. They were too busy preparing to evacuate. Churchill walked through the main gate and disappeared into the alpine forest. For 8 days he walked through the mountains. No food except what he could scavenge. No map except what he remembered from military briefings. His destination was Italy, where Allied forces were advancing. The distance was 100 miles, through some of the most difficult terrain in Europe. Churchill walked it on a broken ankle sustained during the Broch raid a year earlier. He never complained. He later said the walk was peaceful compared to combat. On May 12, 1945, Churchill encountered an American armored unit near Brenner Pass on the Austrian-Italian border. The Americans were suspicious. A British officer appearing out of the Alps with no identification was unusual. Churchill explained who he was. The Americans didn't believe him. They thought he was a German spy. Churchill demanded they contact British command. After 2 hours of radio communication, Churchill's identity was confirmed. The Americans apologized. Churchill asked if there was any fighting left. The Americans said Germany had surrendered 5 days earlier. Churchill was disappointed. He later said, "If it wasn't for those damn Yanks, we could have kept the war going another 10 years."
Churchill returned to England in June 1945. The war in Europe was over. Japan was still fighting in the Pacific.
Churchill volunteered immediately for deployment to Burma. He wanted to continue the war. The British Army said no. Churchill was too valuable as a training officer. His commando tactics needed to be documented and taught to new units. Churchill reluctantly accepted a position at the Commando Training Center in Scotland. He spent the next 6 months teaching British commandos everything he had learned: psychological warfare, unconventional weapons, close-quarter combat, escape and evasion. But he left out the bagpipes and the sword. The War Office had finally convinced him that those were personal choices, not teachable doctrine. Still, his influence spread. British Special Forces adopted many of his psychological tactics, using noise and confusion to disorient enemies, understanding cultural conditioning to exploit enemy behavior, prioritizing shock value over firepower in specific situations. In 1946, Churchill transferred to Palestine. Jewish-Arab violence was escalating. British forces were caught in the middle. On April 13, 1948, Arab militants ambushed a medical convoy traveling to Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem. The convoy had 77 doctors, nurses, and patients. The Arabs opened fire with automatic weapons. British forces in the area refused to intervene. They had orders not to engage either side. Churchill was driving nearby when he heard the gunfire. He had no orders to intervene. He intervened anyway. He drove his vehicle directly into the ambush, placing himself between the convoy and the Arab shooters. Then he got out and started directing the medical personnel to safety. Bullets hit his vehicle. Churchill ignored them. He organized an evacuation, moving doctors and patients to protected positions while under fire. Over the next 3 hours, Churchill evacuated 500 people from the convoy. He made multiple trips through the fire zone, each time returning for more people. Arab militants eventually stopped shooting at him. Later, Arab commanders said they stopped because they realized Churchill wasn't armed. He was rescuing civilians with no weapon. The militants considered it dishonorable to shoot an unarmed man performing a humanitarian act. For this action, Churchill received no official recognition. The British government didn't want to acknowledge that one of their officers had violated orders to save lives. But the Jewish community in Palestine never forgot. Churchill became a hero to them. When Israel declared independence weeks later, Jewish leaders offered Churchill a position in their new military. Churchill declined. He had one more adventure planned. In 1950, Churchill transferred to Australia. He was 44 years old. Most soldiers his age were retiring. Churchill was learning to surf. He had discovered surfing during a visit to Australia in 1949 and became obsessed. He spent the next 9 years in Australia working as a land-air warfare instructor while spending every free moment on the beach. He designed his own surfboards and became one of the first people to surf the tidal bore on the Severn River. In 1959, Churchill returned to England and retired from military service. He settled in Surrey and spent his final decades sailing coal-fired steamboats on the Thames, building radio-controlled model warships, and raising his family. He rarely spoke about the war. When asked about his exploits, he would say, "I was just doing my job." Jack Churchill died on March 8, 1996, at the age of 89. He was buried with full military honors. His claymore sword and longbow were placed on his coffin. In his obituary, the Times wrote, "He was the last man to kill an enemy soldier with a longbow, the last to capture prisoners with a medieval sword, and possibly the last officer in the British Army who believed war should be fought with honor, style, and a sense of theater." Modern special forces still study Churchill's psychological warfare techniques. His understanding that fear and confusion could be more effective than firepower influenced the development of shock tactics used by elite units worldwide. But the sword and the longbow remained uniquely his. No military in the world has ever officially adopted medieval weapons for modern combat. Jack Churchill proved they could work, but also proved that only a man like him could make them work. The lesson wasn't about the weapons, it was about the warrior.